get back from lunch. Again, the meeting's being recorded for everyone, so just so you're aware of that. I think we've got a terrific program this afternoon. We have two really highly qualified people who have been working and thinking and researching collaborative processes for a long time. This is really a great opportunity for you to ask questions in the chat box to our two speakers this afternoon. I'm particularly glad that Steve Daniels has joined us, even though he's out of state right now. He's been able to link up via Zoom, and I used to have Steve join me sometimes in Missoula at the College of Forestry, and he would give lectures and speak to graduate students and the faculty, and every time just knocked it out of the park. Steve, you've just been such an amazing researcher on the collaboratives and their processes and how to make them work. We're really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. So Steve's going to be on first, and then it's going to be followed by Jared Talley from Boise State University, who's also going to discuss this subject about how collaboratives can function more effectively. So again, type your questions into the chat box. Maybe we could have some dialogue back and forth if we have a little time at the end of each presentation. So Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you. I'm really grateful you came. Thanks so much, and looking forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thanks, Jim. That's a kind introduction. Just double checking my audio. You can hear me? Okay, super. So let me go to share screen. Did that transition work, Jim?
No, I don't see your screen yet, Steve.
Okay.
Maybe give it another shot.
Okay. Screen. How'd we do this time?
That's it. You got it.
Super. All right. Well, Jim, your introduction was so kind. I always enjoyed stopping by the university there in Missoula, because I very much consider Western Montana to be home. But the presentation that I'm going to be giving today is kind of uniquely non-academic. Even though I spent 30 some years as a professor, I also worked an awful lot as a facilitator and coach to collaborative groups. And what I'm going to be focusing on today is far more pragmatic than academic and philosophical in any way. So this might be a bit of a change of pace if you're thinking about me coming at this from an academic perspective. What I'm going to be introducing is this idea of the pole form, and I'm very pleased that I have this opportunity to participate in this conference, because this is a rollout. This is a public presentation of something for the very first time, and it's a new tool. I don't expect it to be earth shaking and tectonic, but I really do think it's going to be handy, because for those of us that work with collaborative efforts that involve public lands and outside groups, there are some inherent communication challenges that we all have to work through. And my hope is that this little tool will make that somewhat quicker and somewhat more reliable. So just to tell you how I'm thinking about this, we're all very familiar with this structure of a collaborative group working in conjunction with an agency, that the agency is not part of the collaborative group, but closely allied with it. And a way that the work often gets done is that between the agency and the collaborative group, they might establish a whole bunch of working teams or committees or subgroups, whatever they're called. And it is those working teams that actually get a lot of the work done, that develop and refine the proposals that then go up to the larger groups. And so because those working teams oftentimes consist of participants from the collaborative group and with some assistance from the agency, I've sort of got those multicolored down there in the bottom. So, I mean, this is all the structures that we all have a lot of experience with. And so if we start thinking about, so what are the communication tasks that need to occur to make this process work? First of all, the working teams have got to communicate among themselves. That's that little semicircle down there. There's also got to be really clear communication between the working teams and the sort of the body of the whole. They've got to effectively and clearly convey their proposals up to that group of the whole, so that the group can make decisions about which ones of them they might want to pursue or in what sequence. So there are a lot of communication tasks at that level. And of course, there is the sort of the grand task, which is the give and take of ideas and moving of proposals and projects and priorities back and forth between the agency and the collaborative group. So at a bare minimum, all of these communication flows need to be clear, effective, accurate, efficient. I mean, it is the essence of what these processes have to involve. Well, the kinds of communication challenges that I think makes all those lines difficult to get firm and functioning well is people can be really geographically dispersed. I mean, there can be 100 miles or more between participants in the same process. There's also very different types of language and knowledge. Technically trained people have their ways of understanding, and people who have a lot of sort of idiosyncratic local knowledge of how things have functioned in the past bring that to the table. And there's a chance that people may talk past one another as they use either technical terms or place names. Everybody involved in any collaborative effort that I know is really busy. Agency people are very busy. People who are involved in collaborative groups from the outside are often volunteering their time and have multiple hats that they wear as well. Everybody is busy. To the extent that we can keep things moving quickly, we all win. And finally, the most important thing is that time in meetings is absolutely precious. You want to make sure that that time is used to its very best effect. And anything that you can do to save time when a group is actually having a meeting is a good move. So with those communication challenges in mind, I've developed this tool, and what it is, this acronym POLE stands for Project Overview, Logistics, and Evaluation. And what it consists of is I've written 2 pages of instructions of guidelines that hopefully are clear enough to allow it to be a standalone thing. Somebody could read those couple of pages and then use it. And then it consists of 2 pages to use an academic term, they're sort of open-ended, short answer kind of response to these questions that are overview questions. And then 2 more pages that get into logistics and 2 more that get into evaluation. Now, it just turns out that in all of these 3 categories of questions, there are only 7 questions in each category. It's not like when I say 2 pages of questions, that implies 20 or 30 or 40 questions. There's only 7 in each of these categories. Now, I'm being a little bold down here at the bottom. I say it is intentionally very clear and straightforward. Now, that's for the user to say. You may actually find that it is obtuse and unclear. But I tried really hard to boil it down to the fundamentals. Every one of these sections that has 7 questions started with more like a dozen or 15 questions. And I just kept cooking it back and distilling it till I got to the things that I think are really fundamental and help you accurately describe what a proposed project might be looking like. So to get into a little bit more detail. So there's 2 pages of overview questions. You could almost think about these as the county commissioner questions. If there was a county commissioner who was on the body of the whole, but didn't have a technical natural resources background, if they worked through these questions, they would know why the project was being done, what the whole point was. It's really what, when, where, why, how. It just covers sort of the 30,000 foot. Here's what we're talking about in a really non-technical sort of way. It's kind of the short form, if you will, explanation of why the collaborative group and the agency might be thinking about doing this project. The next 7 questions are these logistics questions, and they get far more detailed and into implementation. So it's, what are the legal authorities that we need to be working about? What steps are we going to do? How are we going to sequence this in terms of other projects or winter or whatever? What's it going to take to get it done in terms of personnel and resources and money? This is where technical specialists who are on a working team really get going. And this is the level at which they need to be thinking about the project to clearly flesh it out. And again, there are only 7 questions here, but they get much more into the implementation than would the overview questions. Now, the evaluation questions, I really don't want you to gloss over, because I think that this is something when people are thinking about starting a project, they don't think hard enough about evaluation early enough. That the funding competitions that I'm aware of, whether you're trying to get money from NIFWIF or whomever, they really want to see an evaluation outcome-based kind of thinking. They want to know what you're going to measure. And how will you know if the project is actually being implemented as developed? How will you know if it's achieving its goals? And in addition, are there important pre-project benchmark measurements that you need to be taking now so that down the road you can clearly evaluate the project and know what you have accomplished or not? It's really a question of, where are you going to hook the tape measure now, so that somewhere down the road you can tell what you got going on. So it is important that you think about evaluation questions as you are doing project development. I mean, we use all sorts of terms like, well, I'm going to reduce wildfire risk. That's what this project's going to do. But what exactly does it mean to reduce wildfire risk, and how would you measure it? Is it measured in tons per acre of fuel within 400 feet of homes? Or is it some vague, oh, I'm sure it must be better kind of notion? The more precision you can get early on in project development, the more clearly everybody will know what you are doing and why. And that's why I think the evaluation questions, even though it is in some ways human nature and tendency to kick that can down the road, really ought to be addressed during proposal development. There are all sorts of ways to use these poll forms, both in terms of things that facilitators can do and ways in which technology might help. Remember my earlier comment about making sure that meeting time is efficiently used? One way to accomplish that is to make sure that poll forms are provided beforehand and people can work through them as pre-reading. Then you're not spending a bunch of time describing the projects. You can get down to second level questions a whole lot quicker. It would also be possible to post them on some kind of a share drive, whether that's a Google Drive or some equivalent platform, so that people can have access to them on a 24/7 basis. We don't all work the same schedules as everybody else. Some of us would be accessing these forms evenings and weekends. Another thing that I like about the poll forms is that somebody who's not on a particular work team could actually fill out a poll form and submit it to a different work team. So you might be on the veg management or the grazing work team and have an idea that you'd really like the recreation work team to be thinking about. You could fill out the overview pages and send it to them and say, hey, why don't you kick this around a little bit? So it provides an opportunity to establish that horizontal line between the working teams that had not been there before, and make sure that the working teams are not siloed. They could see one another's proposals. They could know if proposals prepared by different teams were a little bit at cross purposes. There could be more horizontal creativity and fertilization of ideas than might otherwise be the case. So one of the ways in which I've played around with this is kind of as a two-step process, that you could develop kind of pre-proposals at the level of only having the overview questions developed, the first 2 pages. And a group could say, oh, we like this idea, let's flesh it out some more. And ask that the subsequent 4 pages be developed. You wouldn't have to develop all 6 pages of answers before you sort of shortlisted a proposal. You could do that based on the answers off the first 2 pages. Another benefit that I see to this poll form is as a form of, as a mechanism for groups outside the collaborative group to get their ideas conveyed into the group. One of the criticisms of collaborative processes is that they can be somewhat closed off from people on the outside. People on the outside don't know how to get their ideas considered by the collaborative group. And so if you knew that there were outside groups and you said, here, fill out this poll form and explain to us what you are interested in, you could end up with people feeding their ideas into the collaborative group as a result. So there is as that advantage, potential usefulness as well. So a couple of concluding thoughts. I said that this was a first public rollout of this. And again, I think it's pretty handy. I facilitated a group for over 10 years, and we didn't have a form like this. I do believe that if we'd had a little structure like this, there are times that it would have been really handy and helpful. In the process of developing it, I showed it to people who have been involved in large and well-regarded collaborative processes. They didn't have any kind of a forum like this, but they said, oh yeah, I know this would have been handy from time to time. But the point is, given that this is a first public rollout, there are probably improvements that can be made. And certainly there are improvements that could be made to make it more responsive to a particular context. So once you get some experience with this form, I really encourage you to think about modifying it, adding questions, making them more specific, going into detail. The questions that are on the form now are fairly broad and generic, and don't get down into sort of specifics of a particular issue domain. And finally, given that this is a brand new process and we're just developing and tweaking it, as you use this form, I would love it if you would give me some feedback. about how it went, whether it was useful, any changes that you might have made to make it more useful. This is going to be a public domain kind of product. I'm in very preliminary discussions with the National Forest Foundation to perhaps have them help support it in some way, maybe make it available on their website, or that we post some kind of a little video on how to use it on their website. I don't have any idea yet, but because of my tradition as a public university professor, we're just used to giving away our ideas. And so that's what this is. You do not need to ask my permission. You do not need to do anything but just see if the form is useful and tweak it and let it go. So that's what I have covered. Again, the poll form was distributed through the materials for this conference, but should you want to follow up with me directly, there's my email, and I look forward to the conversations. So Jim, back to you.
Steve, thanks so much. I just put a question in the chat myself. You might want to stop sharing your screen and we can kind of see people if we need to. There we go. You know, just for your information, Steve, you can't maybe see this, but you're breaking up a little bit as if you're transmitting from, you know, the other side of the Voyager spacecraft. But it might be your background information or maybe your connection, but it makes your appearance look a little jumbled. But I want to get to the main point. Your audio is just fine. So
Okay.
if you turn off your camera every once in a while, that you know, there you go. That might help us, just because it was a little distracting. Say, you know, Steve, I really liked how straightforward that was. And I had an initial question, and I think, you know, you have your, Jay was able to put up the link to the poll form in the chat box for everybody. But I'm curious if you've got a really thorny problem, like conflict with an endangered species, or, you know, things like transportation issues, motorized, non-motorized use. Are there ways you can kind of add questions into the logistics or the evaluation pieces that, you know, each group could tailor it to their own needs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, one of my design goals was to make this that if it was a paper form and distributed at a meeting, it would just be front and backs. Okay. So you could have one sheet of paper that was the overview questions, and one sheet of paper that was the logistics questions. But to the extent that that does not give you enough depth, you could make it as long as you needed to. I mean, if you had it more as a PDF kind of document, you wouldn't be limited by the size of an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. So I think particularly in the logistics questions, tailoring those to make sure that they gave you sufficient depth to really explain the project in a particular context. So if it was transportation, and there would be all sorts of things to have to consider, and multiple jurisdictions and all sorts of interwoven regulatory processes could be really important to expand that.
Mm-hmm.
I'd be less enthusiastic about changing the overview questions too quickly, because they're supposed to be very introductory. And then I think you could make the logistics questions as complicated and lengthy as was necessary to really allow people to understand what you were proposing.
I see. That makes a ton of sense. Hey, Steve, we've got some questions in the chat box here. I don't know if you're seeing them. Here's one from Gordy Sanders asking how you envision the applicability of this poll form to the existing Forest Service processes, and how might you anticipate the Forest Service is going to accept it?
So far, my efforts to use it, the Forest Service has been just fine with it.
Mhm.
Because it doesn't compete with other sort of Forest Service processes. In some ways, it just provides an abstract of stuff that can be in much more depth in regulatory and agency administrative processes. So it's yeah, it doesn't compete with or substitute for agency processes. What it does is it provides a mechanism for moving ideas back and forth between the agency and the collaborative group and within the collaborative group. So yeah, just.
Okay. Hey, I'm gonna, there's a couple people with some really compelling things that they brought up, and it might be better just to have them go on screen and ask them their questions to you directly. Andrew Menser from OEMR. Andrew, do you want to unmute yourself and maybe you can ask this interesting question to Steve directly?
Yeah, you bet. I'm having some spotty internet, so I'm going to stay off screen. But if you guys can hear me, Steve, I'm curious if you've laid this poll framework out next to like the FEMA NIMS framework for emergency operations centers and emergency management. There's a lot of similarities, I think. The Department of Homeland Security has a pretty well-established framework for interagency cooperation. I'm wondering if you've looked at any of those documents.
I haven't, and it would be fun to lay those kind of side by side. And so if you want to follow up with me, that would be a fun thing to do. And so this is so sort of basic and clear that I think we're going to find similar sorts of frameworks in a number of domains. I mean, I work with land conservancies, with trusts, and they have sort of screening criteria processes that have some similarities. But yeah, I mean, my email's on the screen. If you want to follow up, I would be intrigued to see what the crosswalks are between them.
Can do. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Andrew. Hey, Liz, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I see you. You got your camera on, Liz Davey. You had a really kind of a nice accolade here about wanting to use it in the greater Yellowstone area. Would you mind, opening that question up a little bit to Steve?
Well, it's more of a comment and just to tout Steve's talents. I worked with him a long time ago in forest planning on the Bridge of Teton, and this whole idea of people gathering their ideas on a piece of paper and writing it down helps people function really well in a meeting and gets their ideas out. And a lot of people, aren't good at standing up and spewing, or they stand up and spew and don't say anything. And I've watched Steve totally facilitate some people who are ready to wring Forest Service people's necks into getting down and dirty on the maps and drawing in circles and arrows and really working to get to the meat of the issue versus just grandstanding and talking about absolutely nothing. And so when I saw that Steve was in fact who I thought he was, I was stoked because I know that this whole document will be really valuable. And I don't see why the Forest Service has to have it fit into our processes. I think it can be part of anybody's collaborative work if they want to adopt it or tweak it. I'm assuming Steve wouldn't mind if you tweak the questions to meet your needs and things like that. But I'm excited to use it. We're starting a new collaborative group or expanding a collaborative group here in the greater Yellowstone area dealing with wildfire mitigation. And I am stoked because we are starting it in 1 month. And I need to figure out how to get people involved. And I'm going to use this, Steve. So thank you.
Oh, Liz, it's good to see you again. I'm sorry my screen's jumping quite so bad, or I'd start that back up. Yeah, you're so kind. I'll be curious to see how it gets going. I actually think that a group that gets started and starts using it from the beginning, it'll become sort of part of the culture and fabric of the organization and an expectation. way in which I think it has some benefit is to create a written memory of what the group has been working on, that it becomes a way to archive ideas. So that if you get a line officer who gets transferred in and is going to work with the organization, and they say, well, what's this group been working on? What's their priorities? And you say, well, in the last couple of years, we've developed these 15 poll forms. Why don't you look them over and see what we've been talking about? Or some individual wants to come join the collaborative group on the other side and say, well, what are you guys focusing on? Well, read these 15 forms, some of which we're working on, some of which we've chosen not to. That'll give you a sense of what we're about. So it becomes a bit of a note-taking form of the efforts and deliberations and priorities of the group. So I'm excited that it comes at a useful time for you, Liz, and follow up and let me know how it works, and absolutely tweak it and change it.
Thanks, Liz. Boy, Steve, what a useful comment that was. Record keeping is so significant for collaboratives, and often it's seen as a burden, and it's tough to do, and to have a format like that really does cover so much territory. That's really a useful piece of this. Say, I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to jump in, who's been listening. And Tim Love, I haven't heard you say very much so far, and you've been so significant with the Montana Forest Collaboration Network. I wonder if you've got a comment or a question for Steve.
Thanks, Jim. It's great to see Steve again. It's been a long time since I've seen him, but I really like this overview process, this logistics and evaluation poll form. I think it has a lot of utility and can be applied for a lot of groups. So thanks for the opportunity to comment, and thank you, Steve, for a great job.
I appreciate the kind comment, Tim. I think it'll be useful. It may go through another generation or two before we really get it where we want it. But again, I can't see how it wouldn't help but be handy.
Yeah. Steve, I'm really impressed as usual. Thank you. I just love its simplicity. I think that is a tremendous strength. And everybody, look in the chat. You can see the link there to the poll form that Jace put in at 1:10 p.m. So you can click on that and see where, where those questions are. That's really great. Steve, you have any closing comments? We're about 10 minutes ahead of time, but on the last day in the afternoon of a conference, that's not a bad thing. And we might be able to get, I know Jared is with us already. We might be able to get started a little bit early, but any closing comments, Steve, that you might want to share?
No, I appreciate the opportunity to get these ideas out there. Just glad to be a resource for my colleagues throughout the Northern Rockies who are working on these issues. And I'll stay on, and I'm interested in hearing what Jared has to say. And so I'll be available for Q&A after his is wrapped up as well. All
right, sounds great. Thank you, Steve. Well, let's move on, everybody. That was really stimulating. And Jared, I'm really pleased that you're here to talk with us about problem definition processes. Jared Talley from Boise State University. He's on their environmental sciences faculty, a native Idahoan. And you're talking to a lot of your colleagues here on this Zoom call, Jared. And thanks so much for being with us. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint that you need to screen share with, but if you'd like to do that and take over, welcome to our conference.
Well, thank you so much. I will screen share here real quick. Give me just 1 second, get it all set up. Just a small correction. I will be with Boise State in August. Right now, I'm actually with University of Idaho. I'm a Idaho Science and Technology Policy Fellow, housed in the Governor's Office of Species Conservation down here in Boise with Jace. And when I come to this work, so I study collaborations, but I kind of study collaborations in conflicted spaces. I'm kind of triage in some sense. When they're going well, I kind of stay away because I don't need to mess up a good thing. But they don't always go well. And so I come in when they're running into problems. And so what I'm sharing with you today is how I think through some of these problems. So if you're in a collaborative space and you're having conflict, maybe this will help provide some language to understand that conflict. But also if you're going into a new collaborative space and you think that you might anticipate some conflict, this might help you navigate that beforehand. So that's kind of where I'm coming from here. But let's just start thinking about what collaboration actually is, or why we might want to collaborate. The ideal, which is very rarely recognized, but this is the ideal. And this is a quote from Laura Van Riper. I think many of you might know her. She's with the BLM out of Oregon, from her paper, Women as Collaborative Leaders on Rangelands in the Western US. And the quote says, "A focus on cooperation, building and advancing relationships and communication that fosters extended dialogue as a way to engage, understand, and develop solutions that address people's differing perspectives and needs. A consideration of issues from a holistic perspective, and a recognition that the social, economic, and ecological dimensions are interconnected pieces of the whole. In an attempt to redistribute power through the use of democratic processes, a concern of equity and an ethic of caring, and a focus on public education, as well as participation in traditional science and a broad acceptance of alternative ways of knowing." Now that's a lot, and that's why I put this up on the screen so you all can read that. But this is the ideal. This is what what collaborative leaders are aiming for in these spaces. But it does get conflicted, and oftentimes we don't reach this ideal because some people collaborate for other reasons. There we go. The social license, and this is very common. It's not bad. It's just not the ideal. The social license form of collaboration recognizes the reality that some people collaborate not for that democratic process, but because they have to, because maybe their job requires them to, or pragmatically it's the way to move forward, something like that. They're collaborating to kind of rubber stamp the organizational or social requirements. They might be required to participate, but they're not actually responsible or accountable to the collaboration. The really kind of the nugget of this is that it gives the appearance of collaborative credibility. Oh, I've gone to the meetings, I've participated, but without actually collaborative accountability, not like being accountable to the group, still being an individual in the group. This isn't necessarily bad. It's just good to recognize that these actually misalign the ideal. So if you're coming into a collaboration thinking that that's what we're doing, and someone else is coming in with the social license, you might have some conflict here. And then the third way that I see often in these conflicted spaces is the steamroller. It's not nearly as common as the first two, but they actually don't participate in collaborations to share ownership of problem definition, but they actually participate to convince other peoples of their own positions and their own solutions. So they come in with an ideological commitment. They say, here's what I want to see happen. And their whole point of this is to move everyone else to their position. You will recognize a steamroller because no matter how much they participate in it, they won't actually commit to the outcomes if they don't actually perfectly align with the ideological commitments. In one very conflicted collaboration I was a part of, they worked together for 2 years. They had this letter that they were sending off, very official letter that they were all signing off on. And at the end, one of the participants wouldn't sign the letter, even though they had participated in the creation of the letter, but they wouldn't sign it because it did not actually align with their prior ideological commitments. Now, I'm not suggesting that these are necessarily good or bad. Of course, I think the ideal would be wonderful, but we often fall in all respects in our life short of the ideal. But I do want to recognize that depending on our motivations for collaboration, we will have some conflicts just in these three. And of course, there's more than those three. And we'll come back to these in a little bit. But before we do that, I want to think what an actual problem is. So I didn't say this, but my training is actually in philosophy. And when I ask questions or when I look at things, I start looking at definitions. And when we're collaborating, we're working together to solve a problem. And so I started thinking, well, what actually is a problem? And this is just the Oxford English Dictionary. It's something that is difficult to deal with, or a question raised for inquiry, consideration, or solution. And when I looked at this, what struck me is this word something. So what is this thing that is difficult to deal with? And what is the relationship to a solution? And as I started thinking about that and looking back at my experience in the collaboratives I work with, but also at the literature itself, I started recognizing that problems didn't stand alone. They stood in relation to situations and solutions. And so this is just a very general kind of framework to think about what a problem is. First of all, a problem demands solution, but problems don't exist out independently of the world. Situations exist out in the world. So here we can see on the top left, it's a flat tire. A flat tire isn't actually a problem. It's just a flat tire. It's a situation. It's only a problem when we see the situation and then we add our values. Let's say I value driving my car, in which case the flat tire now becomes a problem. But before those values, it was just a situation. It's something science is really good at understanding. That's why we have and we need science to understand the situation. The problems introduce values and subjective beliefs. It's a situation plus values equals a problem. And problems demand solutions. So now that I have the flat tires, a situation, I say I want to drive my car, it becomes a problem. My solution might be to refill the tire, right? To make it not flat. Down here on the bottom, you can see the situation is annual precipitation averages. That's just the situation. It's just the facts of the matter. Here's our precipitation. It becomes a problem when we think about the economic damage from climate change, because our values, the economic values, aligned with or in addition to the situation, give us a problem. And then of course the solution might be something like this little thing in the bottom right, the little car that we've got going on there. So this has just introduced this kind of really simple framework to understand the difference between a situation, a problem, and solution. But this actually does help us understand conflict in some of these collaborative spaces. Situations themselves are just statements about the world. We have to recognize they are not yet problems, and situations themselves don't have solutions. Solutions are solutions to problems. Solutions are not solutions to situations. They don't have solutions. So we need to be very clear when we're talking about a situation or we're talking about a problem. Problems are these situations evaluated with values that sometimes we assume, and often we assume. We don't actually talk about when we say, oh, the problem is, we don't say, well, here are my values that make the situation a problem. Problems demand resolution, and problems can actually have multiple solutions. But here's the crux of it is solutions. Solutions are responses to problems, sure. They can be incomplete or complete. They can maybe completely solve the problem, or they can solve a piece of the problem. But here's the big one that I see happening in conflicted collaborative spaces all the time. Solutions don't actually require problems. Some people enter into a collaborative space with a solution, and they're looking for a problem in that space that their solution is the solution to. They're not entering with a situation and letting the group collaboratively and co-define the problem and then let solutions emerge from there. They have a solution. They're looking to figure out which situation they can make into a problem that their solution is an answer to. And when you have people operating at these three different levels without being explicit about what they're actually talking about, we run into a lot of conflict. So these are just some examples to understand how to maybe apply this in the spaces that you guys are working in. On the left, we see there's a situation. That's just an ecosystem. It's a situation. Now, depending on your values or how you're looking at it, it may be a problem because, you know, that could lead to a big crown fire. And if that is the problem, based on the situation, then maybe you need to manage that forest to prevent the crown fire. But at the same time, that ecosystem, maybe people look at that, and some people, and I know there are some people out there that say, well, the actual problem is human intervention with ecosystems. We should not be intervening. And if that's how we're defining the problem, then we'll let the forest manage itself, regardless of how big that fire might get. This is a lot of wilderness rhetoric. But from the same situation, here's the point, from the same situation, we have two different problems and different solutions that are actually contradictory, managing the forest versus the forest managing itself from the same situation, without having the conversation about what are the values here and how are these solutions aligned with our problem definition. We can find conflict that actually destroys things before we've ever really realized what we're talking about or being conflicted about. Here's some more. The situation, we have multiple use forests. We all understand that. On one side, we need access to that forest for management. And when we do have that, let's say our problem is access for management, when we're done accessing, maybe we want to just store those roads or obstruct them so people don't use them, but maybe we want to use them later for additional management. But for that multiple use forest, the situation, other people actually want access for recreation, totally makes sense. But after that access, the solution for access for recreation is leaving those roads open. And of course, we have now contradictory solutions to the same situation. That's where the values come in. And this is helping to provide a framework to talk about these values in ways that don't put people on the spot. Like, well, no, what is the problem? And how does that problem extend from the situation with values? Here again, we have the same situation, multiple use forests. If we need to restore a forest to some healthy state, we need access to that. But maybe we want to actually just reclaim the road afterwards. We want to get rid of the road so that we're not allowing people to go back into that forest that we restored afterwards. Again, contradictory solution from the same situation. Here, this kind of goes back to the wilderness. This is one that in conflicted spaces, I see a lot from multiple use forest. Some people do not like the idea of the use part of multiple use forest, especially the industrial use part of it. And the solution is to stop industrial use and go to wilderness. And of course, you see in these solutions that you're going to have conflict. If people are coming in with these solutions from the same situation, you are going to have conflict, and the collaborative can fall apart if that conflict isn't managed well, and often does. So here's some questions, and actually I love following up with Steve, because maybe there might be an additional sheet that can be put in before we've decided on what project to overview, what the logistics are, and what the evaluation is, to really figure out what that project is, because the project in some sense is a solution to a problem. So maybe these are some questions that can be added to that POLS framework. Asking questions about the situation. What dimensions of the situation are relevant? Remember, it's not a problem, it's just the situation. What facts do we need? But also whose knowledge is used to define the situation. When we're talking about diverse communities, they often know different aspects of a situation that the other parts of the collaborative don't know. So we got to really think through who are we using, or whose knowledge are we using to define the situation itself. Here's the big one. What is the situation and what are the values that combine to define the problem? This is a wonderful conversation to have in conflicted collaborative spaces. Let's just get it out on the table. What are our values? And I know we talk about this all the time, but it's amazing how few collaboratives actually have this conversation and repeat this conversation throughout the process, especially in times of conflict. On the problem side, are the problems defined collaboratively, or are they assumed from the outset? If they are assumed from the outset, remember that you're also assuming the values, because problems don't exist in the world. They already have assumed values that make them a problem. So if you have a collaboration that says, here's the problem we're trying to solve, you may want to take a step back and say, okay, hold on, what's the situation and what are the values that make that situation a problem? And that might help leave open some space for people to talk about where potential conflict might come up, and you can anticipate that. And then solutions. Are these solutions actually responses to the co-defined problems from the collaborative? Or are solutions in this space, are they actually just looking for a problem? Be very careful about those. Here's a quote that I find kind of powerful when we're thinking about problem definition by Todd A. Bryan from Tragedy Averted, The Promise of Collaboration. Why, given our desire for others to feel a sense of ownership of our problems, do we find it so difficult to share in the ownership of their problems? By accepting someone's view of the problem, we often believe we have to negate our own view, our own actions, and in many cases, our own beliefs. For many of us, acknowledging the larger problem is akin to denouncing our own identity and being. And this goes back to the fact that problems don't exist in the world. Problems when we have a problem, we already have our values interlaid in that problem definition. And so by accepting someone else's problem that maybe we don't fully understand, it feels like it's an attack on our own values because it's their values, not ours. And we need to just be honest about this in these conflicted spaces. Now, of course, everybody here has never seen a conflicted collaboration, so maybe this doesn't make any sense to them, but I'd suppose some people are seeing this and understanding. So here's just some simple things to think about. Collaboration on the bottom, on the scale from harder to easier. It's really hard when people enter with solutions, when values are assumed, when people are talking and not listening. They're not closed, or they're closed, excuse me, to trying new things, and there's no leadership. It is easier when people enter with situations, not problems or solutions. They're willing to discuss the values that make situations problems. They're speaking less and listening more, hearing other people's values, open to creative solutions, and there's expert facilitation to guide these conflicted spaces. But I want to get a little more into the weeds on this for a little bit. Because collaborating can be hard because we are all actually just different people. And not only our values, which we've talked about kind of considerably over the last few minutes, but just the constraints that we have to our own actions. And so let's talk about this for a second before I wrap up. I start out with this comic. I love this. I think it has so much applicability to collaborative space. It starts out in the first panel, the chicken and the pig talking to their chicken says, "Hey, pig, I was thinking we should open a restaurant." Pig says, "I don't know, what would we call it?" And the chicken says, "Well, I don't know, how about ham and eggs?" And the pig comments, "Well, no thanks, I'd be committed, but you'd only be involved." Of course, the chicken is giving an egg, the pig is given a ham. And that's a different level of commitment than just giving the egg. And I think we all understand that. But what are we committing to? So the ideal collaborative, everybody's committed. If everyone's just involved, now you're having the social license and steamroller. But in an ideal collaboration, we're all equally committed to co-defining the problems, to co-defining solutions, and working together to enact the projects that solve our problems. But we don't actually have to commit to the whole thing, because some people don't want to commit to the whole thing. They don't have time to commit to the whole thing, or maybe they just don't have the expertise to commit to the whole thing. But we do want to commit to something. So are we committing to the whole process, or maybe just understanding the situation? And this is a wonderful stage for especially university researchers to be involved in that maybe are not familiar with the local communities or the place-based problems that they're dealing with, but they do understand the situation quite a bit. We can commit to helping understand the situation and then back off and let other people define the problem and the solutions. Are we committing to co-defining the problem, refining the problem, or developing solutions? There's no right or wrong answer here, but let's have a conversation about what we are actually committed to at the beginning before it gets conflicted, or if we're in triage and we're trying to figure out how to back us away from falling apart. Let's talk about, okay, hold on, where are we committed in this process, and where are we just involved? Because that actually changes how we run and facilitate the collaboration from there on forward. So here's some things to think about in those conversations. Have explicit conversations about our motivations. Are we being motivated by the ideal? Are we motivated by the social license? Like, hey, this is my job. I was told to come here and be involved in this, but I'm not actually super committed. Wonderful. How do we keep you involved? How do we maybe move you from involved to committed? Or if you just don't want to be involved, that's fine. Commit to the process, not just the outcome. Sometimes it's the best we can hope for. It's like we don't actually know where this is going in a conflicted space when we're doing triage, but can we renew our commitment to the process, the fact that we are working together to get there, even though we don't know where we're going. We want to hold ourselves accountable to the collaboration and also hold others responsible and share experiences, not just facts. I want to go back to this accountable and responsible. Sometimes what I've seen that works really well is in triage, we call it pony up. And we do that. I do this a lot in rangeland collaborations. Sometimes we'll just say, okay, let's go back to our organizations. Let's see if we can each get a little bit of money, put it together in a pot and figure out what to do with that money. And that spending the money, our organizational commitments through the funding processes helps us get from the involved to the committed, because now we have some skin in the game. Sometimes, little things like that work, but we gotta really start thinking about how do we bring people from the involved stages to the committed stages if we want these collaborations to survive conflict. And here is really down in the details on this. We actually all have different skills, abilities, and resources. So on the right, you see university, government, involved, and committed. I'm using those as two different levels of the community. And these intersect with four different things that I see prompting conflict quite a bit in these collaborative spaces is our calendars, our funds, our proximity, and our languages. And Steve kind of talked a little bit about this in the previous presentation. First of all, our calendars. We should recognize that university academics operate on a different sort of calendar, the semester calendar, whereas a lot of government representatives operate on a fiscal year calendar. Community members, I work in rangeland quite a bit, and when you start understanding the range management calendar, when calving season is, when weaning season is, you can start seeing where some of the conflicts are actually just misaligned calendars, and no one thought to actually sit down and say, hey, how do we actually work together in this space where we're all being pulled by different calendars? Our funds that come with sideboards, are they grants? Are people ponying up personal funds? Are they programs that have dedicated evaluation metrics or monitoring metrics? Having these conversations right at the beginning, where's the funding coming from and what sideboards does that give us, helps to limit the conflict that might come up with a wide open space. Like, let's just set the sideboards so we know where we're at. Proximity. I see this actually happen a lot in the work I do in range, because things are so spread out, is we'll have a meeting somewhere at 8 o'clock in the morning. And it turns out that we don't get a lot of people participating in it that have to travel, because they have to travel, which means they have to rent a hotel room or find someplace to stay, which means funds that maybe they don't have through their organization. And so they can't participate. And we don't think about the fact that even when we're just spread out, it can cause conflict. How do we find a way, whether or not that's with funding or a place in between, something like that, or a time in the afternoon instead of the morning, to make everybody feel comfortable that they can be involved and committed to the process. And lastly, the language. We all use different languages. The community use different languages than different disciplines in the research community. And policy itself is a different language. And the one thing I can say here is stop using acronyms, just period, in collaborative spaces, unless you've worked with the same group for a very long time and you all know what the acronyms that are being used are. If you want to see how to get someone not feeling a part of the group and the collaborative space really quickly, use a lot of acronyms that they don't know and they're too afraid to ask because they're in this group space. They will feel very quickly like they're not part of the space and will not be committed to that space. So just stop using acronyms. It's really easy. It's just lazy to use acronyms, to be entirely honest. Recognize that the university has different motivations. They're trying to publish papers because that's their job and that's how they hold on to their jobs. The university demands they publish. It's the publish or perish model. Their funding often takes a lot more time to come through. The grant writing in universities is notoriously difficult, and it could take a year to get funding or more. And there's a lot of inertia in the university, so things don't move fast. They can't jump quickly. Of course, government is very risk averse. They have a hard time keeping people in the roles for long periods of time. So we all know this, that really benefits collaborations. There's litigation that keeps them kind of part of the low risk averseness of the government. It's really hard to keep involved communities accountable to the collaboration, and it's really difficult to keep the committed communities from not being burnt out. The people in the community that oftentimes come to these collaborations, it's the usual suspects, and they're not getting paid to do it. They're doing it because they want to see things better, but they can get burnout very quickly, and their capacity is very limited. So recognizing these differences in skills, abilities, and resources, and the fact that we're institutionally structured, our participation is, having these conversations can, at the beginning, can help us avoid conflict, or in moments of triage, can help us understand where the conflict is coming from and strategize how to get through it without the collaboration falling apart at the seams. Again, here's another little hard to easy in collaboration. It's harder when we are assuming other people's motivations. I didn't talk about this split the contradiction here. I deleted that slide, so I won't go into that right now. It's harder when people are only involved and there's mismatched abilities and resources. And it's really, really hard in collaboration when we avoid difference. It's easier when we actually celebrate difference and we anticipate the conflict that might come out of these mismatched abilities. When we're fully committed and we've just got transparent motivations. Let's be transparent about why we're here, what we hope to get out of it. And then we can at least have the information to figure out how to move forward or whether or not we can move forward. So here's just taking a big step back about collaboration overall. The situation here in Idaho and of course across the West, we've got many interests, many jurisdictions, and real impacts to our decisions. And that prompts different views about how to solve problems. Some people think that the experts know best and the experts should just make the solutions and everyone should get in line and follow them. Some people think that collaboration is the way, but the problem is that it's actually truly difficult. Like, how do we collaborate across these communities? But it's really difficult. If you think that someone knows best, the experts can just tell us what to do, you don't want to collaborate. You just want to steamroll. That's the motivation that's putting you into a collaboration. If you do, you're just looking for who you think the expert is that has the solution and steamrolling the collaborative space into that solution. If you think collaboration is truly difficult, but you're committed to it, you think that's the best way to move forward. Sometimes the solution is to try to simplify it, to try to just make it really, really simple. We just need trust and more funding, capacity, and these things will work. The fact of the matter is that that's not true. You know, languages and schedules and problems, these things all will destroy a collaboration that has a lot of funding and even people trust each other, but they still can't make anything work. So try to not oversimplify it, although try to make things simple, but try not to neglect the complexities of this. And here on the other side, one of the solutions to understanding the problem of collaboration being truly difficult is just to confront the complexity and have these discussions early, often, and especially in moments of triage. So I'm going to leave you with this one last quote by Jane Addams from Democracy and Social Action. Genuine experiments towards higher social conditions must have a more democratic faith and practice than those which underlie private venture. Public parks and improvements intended for common use are, after all, only safe in the hands of the public itself. And associated effort towards social progress, although much more awkward and stumbling, aka collaborative, than the same effort managed by capable individuals, does yet enlist deeper forces and evoke higher social capacities. This is heralding back to the ideal. This is why we collaborate, to evoke these higher social capacities. And with that, thank you. please feel free to reach out to me anytime with any questions, or if you have a triage situation, maybe I can help you out. There's my information, and I look forward to talking with y'all. And I'll stop sharing. So thank you.
Jared, thank you. What an outstanding presentation. I really appreciate how your slides laid out the difference between the situation and the problem and the solution. I thought that was quite elegant. But I have a question for you. I have to say, I put it in the chat. We heard from Steve and others in this conference about the significance of communication, and you brought that out, especially right there near the end. So is it just the conversation, or do we need observations of different alternatives and solutions? How is it that that conversation can be somehow supercharged?
Do you mean, let me just ask you a question. I want to clarify really quick. Do you mean when we're faced with these conflicts, it really is just having a conversation to get us past it, or is there other things that need to be happening as
That's
well?
exactly what I'm asking. Are there other things that need to be happening? Yes.
Yeah. I actually don't know the answer to that. My personal opinion, and I think the research bears this, is that there does need to be other things happening. But the fact of a discursive community, a community that is brought together based on conversation and their ability to communicate with each other, shouldn't be overlooked. And it's, when we say we need better communication, oftentimes what we really mean is we need different communication. And sometimes that looks like asking different questions. Sometimes that looks like having a different disposition in answering those questions or being faced with those questions. Mm-hmm. And sometimes it actually just looks like getting out of the conference room and having the conversation on the land instead of around a table. And it's amazing how these little changes, just by walking outside and having a conversation around a picnic table rather than a conference room, changes the tenor of the conversation. Mm-hmm. I don't know how many people are familiar with Bob Chadwick. He's done a lot of work in collaborative spaces here in the West for a very long time. He's a big fan of the circle, right? Instead of sitting with one person facing the other, sitting in a circle, and how these change the tenor of the conversation. So sometimes it is just reorganizing the collaborative group. I think the discourse itself is really important, the questions we ask and our disposition to those. And yes, sometimes it is funding. Sometimes it is the way that power is operating in the room. Sometimes it's a connection on an internet that is, I've seen this because I work with people that don't have good connection out in the range. And it just makes us, they can't communicate, right? But I think the power of conversation is critical and needs to be looked at.
Thanks, Jared. No, wonderful answer. I appreciate that. Yeah, the different perspective from going in the field, for example, is often really, really helpful.
Absolutely.
Hey, I'd like to open it up. Feel free to unmute yourself. I don't see any other questions in the chat right now, but feel free to unmute and ask Jared a question if you've got one.
I'm looking at the chat real quick, seeing what questions were raised. Oh, well, I guess I just have to say thank you for all the kind words, everybody. That's wonderful. I appreciate it.
Hey, Jared, this is Carl.
Yeah.
Hey, as a land manager, one of the things I always struggle with is kind of the burden of stewardship, of knowing, the current condition and how out of whack things are and the consequences of not doing anything. And I struggle with whether that's a situation or whether that's a problem, because the situation is that things are so altered from their historic conditions with fire suppression and the species composition and structure changes. And one could argue philosophically, well, Mother Nature's putting it back in balance. Insect and disease are taking care of the overstock. And it's too bad that people, are impacted by wildfires. But the problem is that many of the ecosystems now are burning so severely that they're not even returning back to forested ecosystems, that they're turning into some other state.
Yeah.
And some of the researchers that I'm working with are sharing that with me. And I'm just wondering, that's really kind of above us to decide whether that's a problem or a situation if we're going to something entirely altered and different than what was historically there.
Yeah, that is a problem. But the situation, you're right to say, the situation is that these things are just changed. They're altered, right? It's a different ecosystem now than it was 100 years ago. It's a problem if we don't like the situation, if we think that it should be different. That's what makes it a problem. And maybe often we agree on that we don't like how it is. We don't like the altered state, but it's still a problem. And there's a value that's inlaid in that. And even if we all agree, we can have that discussion about why is it a problem? Is it a problem because of fire and the risk to dwellings? Is it a fire because, or is it a problem, because a fire might be come through and wipe it all out and change it to something else that we don't even actually know? Is it a problem because my cows can't feed themselves anymore? Something like that. We might agree that it's a problem, but those three things, those are three different problems that demand potentially three different solutions. So without having the conversation, the situation is, it's an altered state. The problem is whatever this one solution could be. It's just a way to open up the conversation about what is the problem and why is that a problem of the situation? What are the values underlying that?
Yeah, it's just hard to deal with folks when they say, so what? So let it change,
Yeah.
And then, you're dealing with, altered species ecology and it's hard to answer that.
It is very difficult. And actually, this is probably where I see the most conflict and collaboration happening in these deeply philosophical ways, where it's like, well, no, so what? Let Mother Nature take care of it. And that's obviously going to compete with any sort of management. And that'll tear something apart so quick. And,
right.
Sometimes I look at a group and I say, I know you want to collaborate, but you shouldn't. There ain't no working past this. And it's just the fact of the matter. Collaboration isn't a panacea. It's hard work. And if people aren't willing to come together in that respect, then there ain't no magic bullet that'll help it.
Thanks for that evocative question. Anyone else have a question that they want to offer to Jared?
Yeah, Jared, my name is Andrew Scowland. I'm a district ranger on the Nez Perce Clearwater here. Really thought-provoking presentation, certainly. And one of the things that brought to my mind is, collaboration, it seems like in its truest sense, is sharing some of that decision authority or that decision-making role. Yeah. And there's some kind of tension in that, coming from an agency perspective, especially as a line officer, where, that's, and I see this even in my own team that I work with is, we're trying to collaborate on projects and figuring out what that right balance is out on the landscape. At some point, I or someone else have to make the decision about, this is what we're doing, this is what we're not. And so if you were to put yourself in an agency line officer role, can there be true collaboration? Because that decision, that responsibility of the decision ultimately lies with the agency.
Yeah.
I don't know. I just kind of put that out there as a thought of, is it true collaboration that we're doing, or is it collaboration light? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's such a wonderful question. You're right. The agencies have a legal mandate to not abdicate authority, right? Like the agencies cannot abdicate authority. The final decision lies with the agencies, and that does provide a contradiction to the ideal collaborative spirit where we're co-decision making. You're right. And that itself is going to prevent us from ever getting to that like true ideal collaboration, which shouldn't stop us from working towards it. But there are different ways that we can be disposed towards it. One way is to say, okay, here's how things have been done in my district or in my force for a long time. I come into a collaboration, I'm hearing everything else. I'm trying to, be open-minded about something, but I hear something that's like, I just don't see how that's going to work, and I shut it down. Another way to say is like, I'm going to go in, I'm just going to be open and say, hey, let's figure out what the ideal solution and what the problem is. Let's codifine it. Let's codifine a solution, and let me take it back, and we'll see how close we can get to that solution given the sideboards we have. That second way allows the collaboration to define the problem and define the solution without making the promise of, without abdicating authority, saying, hey, if we can do that, wonderful. But we do have to fit this into the existing frameworks. We have to find funding. We have to make sure it's defensible. That's just the fact of the matter. But having that openness to say, let's come up with the craziest idea and we'll see how close we can get to it, instead of saying the craziest idea won't work, so we shouldn't even get into those gray spaces. That's a really big change in the disposition of the collaborative space, and it changes the way people work together. You might come back and say, okay, we couldn't do that because that was a crazy idea, but we can actually get close in these ways and try something new, right? And maybe we don't have to abdicate authority. We can do it within the existing frameworks, and just because it hasn't been done doesn't mean it can't be done, sort of thing. That's such a wonderful question, and I get versions of that question quite a bit because it's a big issue here in the West with all the public lands.
Yeah, no, really appreciate that thought. And, it's just, there's always the ideal, and then at some point reality hits you in the face. So
Yeah.
Thank you. Great presentation though.
Yeah, I'll tell you, without regarding BLM districts, because I work with the BLM quite a bit, not necessarily the Forest Service, although in some sense. There's 2 BLM districts, and I'm not going to say who in case people are with them on this call, but they share a boundary. And in one district, the collaborations are just wonderful. And the things that they do, like the creative solutions, and they're just moving forward all the time. Just across that boundary, the other one, things don't happen at all. I mean, it's a culture of no, even in the collaborative spaces. And what that tells me is that it is about the disposition of the people. It's like there are ways to do it, but it's that, well, let's be open to it and see how close we can get, instead of let's be closed to it and then we never even try. And that's just going to put a stake in the heart of that collaboration so quick. So thanks, Andrew.
Well, Andrew and Jared, I think that's an excellent way to close this discussion. That was a very fine question, Andrew, and Jared, an outstanding response. Jared, thank you very much. I see Steve Daniels is still on. Steve, thank you for the new tool that you introduced and for all the work that you've done. I wish we were in a live audience so you could hear applause because you practically deserve a standing O, both of you, for all that great work. So thanks again.
Thank you. I appreciate you all inviting me.
Hey, I want to move on to the last phase of our conference. And there's 2 things I want to do. First of all, I want to put back into the chat box this question that Dennis Becker put in just before lunch and before he had to leave, about how else might the IFRP and the MFCN support local collaborative efforts. Take a moment right now to kind of think, especially based on what we've heard today and yesterday, what services or what information or what types of support can these 2 associations offer to your collaborative or to your ranger district or other place where you're working. We've seen how this collaborative spaces, Jared and Steve have been talking about, has a lot of latitude. We have a lot of agency in this. Our ability to make a difference is real. So if you can put something in there now, type it up, and we're going to save the chat. This is going to be very helpful to the leadership of both IFRP and MFCN. So I really appreciate that. And just before we close, I want to not only give you that moment to be able to type in your response to this, but I want to be able to thank the organizers of this program, the people who worked on the planning committee, the individuals who were sponsors and supporters, all of you who registered for the program and took your valuable time to join in these conversations, to add to this dialogue. I'm very grateful, and I know that the Montana Forest Collaboration Network leadership and the IFRP leadership is grateful as well. It's been a powerful learning experience, and it feels like what it is that we're supposed to do as organizations, is to encourage this kind of interaction. We will be allowing for ongoing communications about this conference. We're going to be working with the Langdon Group to make sure that the recording for this is available on the websites of both organizations. If you want to revisit some of the presentation, there's been a lot of information since Tom Schultz started yesterday morning. So please, look up our websites and you'll be able to find this in a few days. I'd like to take a moment to make sure I acknowledge and allow to speak the chair of the Montana Forest Collaboration Network, Gordy Sanders. And then after that, I'd like to ask John Robison from the IFRP to offer any kind of concluding remarks to kind of send us off into an afternoon, give us an extra half hour for whatever it is we might want to do, stand in the sunshine or get up and stretch a little bit before we get on with the rest of our day. So Gordy, can I ask you to turn off your mute button and offer a few closing remarks?
Sure, thanks, Jim. One, I want to really thank you and Dennis Becker for doing a great job moderating, facilitating, keeping things flowing. I mean, you guys have done a great job, even though you're in different states. So anyway, amazing. So I just want to thank all the speakers. Everybody did a great job. Lots of great information. I think I've got 10 pages of notes, Jim. I know how you keep notes, and I know you got 20. You write faster, and you write in all the corners. There isn't a blank spot on the page. Anyway, thank you all. I think there are some key messages we've all heard about over and over. And there's different words that have surfaced: urgency, synergy, deliberate approach. I think that's a great approach. I think why here, why now? I think there's a lot of things that came together, and I think a lot of bits and pieces resonated with different folks that attended during this session or the last 2 days. It's hard to kind of summarize when you get that much information. I'll let John do that. But so keep in mind for the collaboratives, really appreciate Jared's comments and Steve. Make sure in the collaboratives you invite Forest Service to attend, BLM, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. How about rural fire? Not somebody that is a fire management officer on the forest, but rural fire. I think that's very important in these rural settings. And you've got to have certainly our NGOs. And thinking about this, one, status quo is not an option. Neither is failure. And don't be victims of little thinking. We've got, everybody's laid out. Yesterday, we heard a lot of enthusiasm, momentum, can do, the sense of urgency, resonated with all the different presenters. So at this leadership level, they're motivated to help get things done. Certainly on the ground level, they haven't really probably felt much of that, or they're not really sure what's really going to unfold. But I think there's some great things that can happen. I think it's really important. And not only does the agency show results, wherever they report out to the committees, as Darren laid out earlier today, but what their plan is Now, I think, well, I would envision is they report out maybe what they accomplished this year, the first year, but here's where we're going in year 2, 3, 4, 5. And they at least have to have a solid 5-year plan. I think it's incumbent upon those collaboratives to kind of help roll up their sleeves, help them craft projects, give them ideas on where to go, give them recommendations. You know, the idea that collaboratives take a long time to come to a decision. You know, a lot of the collaboratives are fairly well seasoned. And maybe one thing we've learned the last couple of years is the benefits of Zoom. You can bring people together quicker, shorter time frame. Everybody knows everybody. And you can actually, I think we've got the ability now to streamline things. I think we just need to pursue it and not be afraid to do that. I do understand the agencies may be concerned a little bit that waiting till the collaborative meets again next month for some kind of a recommendation decision could kind of walk on their plan, and maybe they have to pursue something beside, you know, rather than waiting to hear some feedback from the collaborative. So anyway, with all that, appreciate everybody's attention. Great comments, questions, feedback, and you know, for those, the Langdon group that kind of set all this up has done remarkable. And anyway, all the technology worked. That's cool. Anyway, I'll pass it on to John.
Thanks, Gordy. I just want to say thanks to everyone for being here, being present, and sharing ideas. Just a couple of themes from my perspective, building on what Gordy and others had said, is that we've got some momentum now. So there's acknowledgement that we're in the midst of a crisis. The status quo is unacceptable. The stars have aligned in terms of funding and commitment. And you know, the let's go is very much paramount. We also recognize we need to build support, public support for forest restoration, that folks aren't, you know, ecology wonks or aren't involved, you know, in the rural economy. How do we get those folks on board? And so how do we get everyone to make sure we all go together? And there are creative ways to address concerns about logging the big trees or the level of NEPA analysis and public involvement. But we have to make sure there's space at the table for folks who have those concerns and are willing to engage in that conversation. And I just wanted to highlight real quick, just a quick shout out to the Salmon Chalice National Forest. They have just released their fuels reduction and restoration project environmental assessment. And, you know, they've been for the last 10 years, you know, treating about 4,000 acres a year with prescribed fire. They're seeking to double that, hopefully more. The project is looking out, you know, 15 years or so. The Forest Service had originally proposed this project as a categorical exclusion, which drew some criticism from stakeholders from kind of both sides of the spectrum. Got a little coverage in High Country News. And the Salmon Chalice came back later with an actual environmental assessment, and even just as important, a really relatable story map highlighting the community values at risk and including links to the relevant scientific supporting articles. And, you know, no, the EA didn't have a public comment period on the EA itself, which may not be ideal for some perspectives, but the Forest Service did make significant changes and improvements in direct response to public scoping. And so anyway, the story map just includes tools to explore and understand the risks, the values, the vulnerability of the communities, and the need to restore natural fire. So it's a very compelling narrative there. I just thought it was a great example. You know, we don't have to recreate the wheel, but as we're going, there's already really good examples of things we can pick up on, build on, improve as we go. And I'm really optimistic that, you know, based on this momentum and these conversations, we really have the best chance ever to really see what's working and leave our forests and communities in a better place. So thank you very much, everyone, and for all the Montana Forest Collaborative Network and IFRP members and our facilitators and the Langdon Group and all the participants.
Thank you, John. Wonderful closing comments. Gordy, thank you too. What a terrific conference. It's been inspiring for me. We're a group of optimists. We're going to keep going, and it's springtime, and let's make this a great year, everybody. So I appreciate you all being here. Thanks again to all the participants in the IFRP and MFCN, and keep up the good work, and we'll stay in touch.
Thank you, Jim.
All right. Thanks, Sarah. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thanks, Jim.